Which real-life serial killer frightened and disturbed you the most? Dean Corll. I almost puked when reading about the methods of torture he used on little boys. He was such an a-hole that his teenage accomplice was the one that killed him, which revealed his 28-plus murders to the public. There was a haunting photo of an unidentified victim that was found in his accomplice's property years after they got busted. Nobody has any clue who the kid is, but the image of distress on his face and the toolbox full of torture tools next to him have forever been burned into my mind. Story 2. East Area essayer who went on to become the Golden State Killer, and we now know as Joseph James D'Angelo. This guy would stalk his victims for weeks, leading up to attacks, along with many other houses, while he was working as a police officer. When he attacked, he was relentless and would stay in the house for hours, messing with his victims. When cornered, he would kill without a second thought. Story 3. For what it's worth, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng are the serial killers who disturb me most. I find the addition of torture, mutilation, and violent essay to murder to be particularly disquieting. Leonard Lake committed self-unaliving soon after his arrest. Charles Ng is serving life on death row in the Big Q, San Quentin. He has displayed zero remorse. Despite being a serial killer geek and having read about and seen documentaries about loads of serial killers, those two are really high on my list of killers, and not only creep me the F out, but also break my heart. There are several things which I think make that case stick with me many years after first looking into them. The fact that they had this whole dream about having a bunker where they would keep the slaves, that they actually built and used it. It's something out of a really dark horror movie. We're not just talking about a room in their house, this was a whole complex underneath their house, soundproof and escape-proof, with room for several captives at a time. Here they planned to live happily ever after. The video diaries that Leonard Lake made about his dream of owning women as slaves is super eerie to watch. I can't remember the exact wording, but he talks about having a woman to cater to his every whim, and then, when he has gotten his needs satisfied, he can just put her back on the shelf again, until the next time he wants to use her like she was a book or something. It's both the description and the calm way he says it that creeps me the F out. There's a video available to the public of the two of them with a woman they've caught. It's not violent per se, but it is super haunting. I'm it, one of them. Sorry, I can't remember who all this info is just from memory. Sorry. Starts cutting her bra off with a knife. She tried to cover herself while telling them to stop. Her voice is almost robot-like. She's clearly in shock. If I'm remembering correctly, and it's in the same tape, this is not the worst thing about the video though. I wish it was. See, the woman keeps asking about her baby, where it is, and for them to give it back to her. This effing breaks my heart. This also brings me to the last point. The two of them were only interested in the women, but instead of being patient and waiting for a lone victim to come along, they just disposed of whoever was with them, like they were nothing. The worst part for me is that at least two of the women, it might be more, had babies with them when they were caught by the pair. As far as I'm aware, authorities still don't know if the babies were murdered by these a-holes, but certain evidence apparently led police to think that they might have been sold. On the one hand, I'd like to think that they are alive somewhere. On the other hand, what kind of people would buy a baby on the black market from two shady guys with no paperwork or anything else to prove that the baby belonged to them? I think it's the combination of foresight, violence, and heartbreak, plus the fact that so much of it is preserved on film by the killers, that has caused this case to be ingrained into my brain forever. It's quite a rabbit hole to dive into, but it will stick with you forever. Story 4. There's recently been a series in the UK on serial killer Dennis Des Nilsen, a Scottish killer who lived in London and prowled bars and streets for young men to entice back to his flat. He killed many people and was caught after a plumber found human bones and a mass of flesh in the drains. Turned out Des was dismembering his victims and trying to flush the remains. In his previous flat, he would burn and bury the remains, but his second flat was top floor of the 3-story building, so he resorted to flushing. The police found the remains of 3 men in bin bags in a wardrobe, as well as under a drawer in the bathroom, and a head in a large cooking pot on the stove. One killing which stood out for me was a young guy Des found outside his property one day who was unwell. He helped the guy get to the hospital for treatment. Days later, the young man went back to thank Des for saving his life, stayed for a drink, and Des drugged, strangled, and dismembered him. This reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer and the lad who escaped his flat to the police. who then delivered him back to Dahmer's flat. People in the world astound me. There will never be peace whilst people like this exist. Story 5. A guy I used to work with at Best Buy. He would tell us stories about his time in Iraq and how much he would enjoy combat. He was a sharpshooter, and his stories would very clearly highlight his enjoyment in the lives he took. The last conversation I had with him was during a 4th of July work party, where he expressed the thing he loves most about the holiday. He loved that everyone would automatically thank him for his service, without knowing that the part he loved most about the service was the lives he took. He quit before the company could fire him. He's still out there and probably still showing off his tattoos and relishing in the mountains of praise he constantly gets for having passed military service. Story 6. Jeffrey Dahmer, but not for the reason or reasons you think. When he was 4 years old, in 1964, he had to undergo surgery for a herniated scrotum. And actually, as I was writing this and fact-checking myself, I only just found out that it was his scrotum. When I first heard about this, I assumed it was his stomach. There's some speculation that the pain before and after the surgery contributed to his future sexual depravity. But how I heard about it originally and the connections I made on my own later are what seriously disturbed me about Jeffrey Dahmer. No one told him he was about to undergo surgery, they just sprung it on him. After surgery, he went totally nonverbal for an extended period. He was obviously traumatized from the experience. But why would he be traumatized from an otherwise minor surgery? Here's something a lot of people overlook about the 60s in regards to medical crap. The common thought back then was that small children didn't feel pain like adults did, so they weren't given anesthesia. Poor baby has to have a surprise surgery on his genitals without anesthesia, went nonverbal from trauma, and then started getting an interest in collecting dead animals. It snowballs from there, no more poor baby sympathies. We hear a lot about the abuses serial killers suffered as children, which has a whole interesting chapter in sociology and psychology. But I think a huge contributor for Dahmer was the medical misconceptions of his era. Story 7. Ted Kaczynski. His manifesto is full of near-prophetic warnings about the negative implications of technological encroachment into everyday life. His lifestyle predicted future trends in minimalism and survivalism. His philosophy is eclectic in origin yet cohesive in ideology. I find him tremendously relatable based on his writings. And then he sent bombs through the mail to blow up whoever happened to be working in the mailroom at a variety of airports and universities. He scares me most because he's not some seemingly alien, emotionless killer, but someone who I feel like I would meet and befriend in local community activism or at a university. He was a genius in multiple areas, went to Harvard to study math at 16, got swept up in government LSD mind control trials while there, and over several years came up with some highly socially conscious ideologies while simultaneously killing people. As someone who has always wanted to run away and live in self-sufficient isolation in a cabin doing psychedelics and living off the land, his story serves me a very personally relevant cautionary tale. Story 8. I would have to say Georgia Tann. She kidnapped and sold hundreds of babies and young children with help from her accomplices, refused to properly feed them and get them necessary medical treatment when they were sick, kept them all crammed together in a room even when they had contagious illnesses, and killed the sickly ones and the ones she deemed undesirable. One such way she would dispose of them was she, or one of her workers at her request, would leave them outside in the sun to slowly bake. She was called the mother of modern adoption and received heaps of praise from well-known public figures of the time, including Eleanor Roosevelt. And she never got caught because she was in politicians' pockets, as well as the police. Her horrible crimes and her true nature only came to light after she died from cancer, and everyone that worked for her spilled the beans once they found out. Every time I hear about that woman, I get sick to my stomach and get angry at the fact that nobody did anything to stop her. Not one person. Story 9. I don't normally post on Reddit, but I created an account just to comment this. I grew up in Florida, unfortunately. Both of my parents also spent their youth here. My dad told me a story years ago that has stuck with me to this day. Back in the early or mid-80s, my dad, who was in his early 20s at the time, and his good friend were out driving along I-95 late one night. There was a young woman thumbing for a ride, so they pulled over and picked her up. My dad said that she seemed very distant and somewhat upset at first, but he and his friend were very friendly and made small talk with her, and she seemed to lighten up a bit on the ride. She asked to be let out at the next exit, and they obliged. My dad said he's 99% sure the woman they picked up was Aileen Wuornos, and somehow that little bit of humanity they showed her was enough to keep them from becoming potential victims. He also made it a point to mention that she had a really tragic backstory. That really made me think, and it stuck with me even to this day. Story 10. I'm surprised no one mentioned them. Dnipro Maniacs. There were 3 guys in Ukraine, I believe around 20 years old. They were killing around 15 people in absolute horrible ways, just waiting next to the road in a forest for their victims. The first victim was a 50-something-year-old grandfather who, despite having survived very nasty throat cancer, still went to work on his moped so he could feed his family. They hit him while he was driving by, took him into the woods, and attacked his head with a hammer. They even made jokes about how crazy it was that the dude was still breathing, even though a part of his brain was literally visible, and his whole head and face was destroyed. The worst part is they filmed this whole thing, and it is available on the internet. Just a warning, this is not safe. Don't look it up. This will change your life for the absolute worst. The craziest thing even still is that they came from rich families, and one kid's dad was a well-known lawyer who was friends with the president or something. He actually tried to claim that the hundreds of pictures and videos all have been edited and photoshopped to frame his son. The judge, of course, dismissed this and said the level of editing would need a multi-million-dollar studio to fake it. As far as I know, they are both still rotting in jail. Story 11. The F. Is no one mentioning Jeffrey Dahmer? Seriously, one of the most effed up ones out there. He started off with drugging and assaulting men, either ones off the street or at bathhouses or gay bars. He was quickly banned from those. Tried to curb the urges with a mannequin he stole from a store. His grandma found it and threw it out. One of his first murder victims was killed in a hotel, wheeled out in a suitcase, dismembered, filleted, then bones crushed. Took him about 2 hours, but he kept the head and boiled it so he could keep the skull and use it for self-pleasuring. He then moved on to make a living mannequin or living zombie by drilling holes into his victims' heads and trying to inject liquids like bleach into them. You can imagine the outcomes. To get rid of bodies, he would dismember them and later dissolve the parts in acid. Many of his later murders involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and saving or preserving body parts. He even kept one victim's head in genitalia and acetone and kept them in his work locker. He worked at a chocolate factory. I think one of the most effed up parts was that he ended up killing one brother and essaying the second years apart. One of the brothers even managed to get away, and despite being underage, Dahmer said that they were lovers and he was drunk. His victim was actually drugged and had a hole drilled in his head already. Dahmer was able to take him back to his apartment and finish the job. Dahmer would also often take pictures of his dead victims in various poses, talked to the heads, and preserved many of the skeletons and skulls to keep. Yeah, I would say Jeffrey Dahmer's easily the killer that scares me the most, although I'm not familiar with all the serial killers by any stretch of the imagination. However, I may or may not live a fair 5 minutes from the Dahmer house, so the stories were passed around more than I would like to admit as a kid, and it sticks with you. Story 12. I grew up in a neighborhood in New York City with a lot of people from Belfast who fled the fighting during Troubles. I would hear stories about the violence from friends' parents and remember hearing about the Shankill Butchers, who would grab people late at night they suspected of being Catholic and disembowel them and leave them for dead in the gutter. Many times they killed their own Protestant members who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The leader of the group was such a piece of garbage the Protestant paramilitaries set him up so that Catholic paramilitaries could murder him. Belfast was a scary place to visit as a kid, and knowing that sort of evil went on top of all the other heck that was breaking loose, was pure terror. Belfast is still a place of great sadness, and the hatred is still just under the surface. I worry Brexit will unknowingly unleash another campaign of terrorism up in the north. Story 13. My great-aunt Wanita Hoyt. While living in New York, she killed all 5 of her kids, while 4 of them were just babies. I think she had 5 kids. Basically, every time she had a kid, she ended up suffocating them to death at the age of 2 to 5, I think. She even tried blaming it on SIDS. Kind of disturbs me because that kind of person is in my family, and mental health in my family isn't the best. Just glad my grandma and my mom loved their kids. Simply look up her name and you will see everything about what she did. My grandma then moved from New York to Texas with the kids he had at the time. Story 14. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. He was a convicted serial child assayer and attempted murderer. He has never actually been proven to have killed anyone, but was convicted of the attempted murder of children many times. He has also been connected to the disappearances of many young boys and girls. When police raided his home, they found coded journals that detailed his victims' list and kill record, as well as accounts of the killing and eating of several children. There were also recipes for chili, burgers, and pot pie that called for human meat, as well as directions for butchering human body parts. His day job was as a short-order cook. He used to hold neighborhood cookouts and served burgers, spaghetti casserole, and meat pies to the people of his neighborhood. There are many accounts of the neighbors that ate at these gatherings, noting that the meat had an odd taste. He's the prime suspect in the disappearances of many children. Fortunately, he died in prison in 2008. Story 15. Personally, I find serial killers fascinating, so I'll share a story my mom told me a while back. My mother grew up in California and lived in a very peaceful neighborhood, as there were lots of families and elders. When she was around 10, sometime in the mid-80s, she was woken up by a faint noise coming from her brother's room. She has 3 that share the same room. At first, she wasn't too concerned about it, but she couldn't sleep as it kept going. She finally got up and walked into her brother's room. She saw a hand reaching in through the window and trying to unlock the door. The way the house was set up is that the windows in her brother's room had no glass, just bars, as it was meant to be some sort of back room. She screamed as soon as she saw the hand and watched in terror as a figure ran off, jumping the brick fence in the process. When my grandparents and uncles asked her what happened, they all thought she was crazy, but when they went outside to water the plants, she noticed a brick was missing from the fence, most likely from when the person jumped over it. The next day, there was a report of a murder in the exact same neighborhood as her. The victims ended up being that of Richard Ramirez, the LA Night Stalker. To this day, she believes her and her family would have been dead had it not been for her waking up to the noise. Story 16. I know this is basic of me as a true horror fan, but Ed Gein. He was the hometown boy / repair guy. Literally no one suspected him until his second murder. Everyone thought he was a chill dude until they took a look in his shed and home. He apparently gave his entire confession over a piece of pie. For those who don't know who he is, he's the inspiration for Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He would rob graves and skin the corpses. He only ever killed 2 women, but he treated them so brutally that he stuck out in the American conscience. He literally skinned and gutted them like they were deer. This was mostly because of his effed up relationship with his mother, which is portrayed inaccurately in the horror movies inspired by him. For me, the fact that he was so normal and considered the simple boy is what makes him terrifying. He was considered so normal, no one suspected him until the second disappearance. He was one of the most effed up people on planet Earth. Story 18. Samuel Hoffman. A kid I knew in high school who dropped out to fight MMA professionally. He was an a-hole to just about everyone in his direct environment, at least outwardly, and was somehow beloved by a pretty large group of people in spite of that. He was a presence at parties, and someone to smoke with, I guess. But about 5 months after dropping out, Mr. MMA kidnapped and killed his longtime girlfriend, another former student. He picked her up from her new school, shot her in a parking lot nearby less than 15 minutes later, and drove around with her corpse in the passenger seat for nearly 24 hours before ending his life as cops approached his car after a short pursuit. What disturbs me the most about what happened is the fact that people seem to ignore that he killed his own girlfriend. There are vigils for him, memorials on Snapchat, and no acknowledgement of the fact he got in fights with teachers, fights with his peers, and was an abusive murderer. It really opened my eyes to the fact that people will ignore things they know for the lies they want to believe. Like the Ted Bundy case, where women thought they loved him. I feel poorly for them. They lost a friend, sure, but oh my gosh. Please consider the optics of saying twice a year, "Fly high Sam," on the internet. Story 19. Vincent Li. The killing of Tim McLean, a brutal Greyhound bus murder in Canada. According to witnesses, McLean was sleeping with his headphones on when the man sitting next to him suddenly produced a large knife and began stabbing McLean in the neck and chest. After the attack began, the bus driver pulled to the side of the road and he and all the other passengers fled the vehicle. The driver and the 2 other men made an attempt to rescue McLean, but were chased away by Li, who slashed at them from behind the locked bus doors. Li ultimately decapitated McLean and displayed his severed head to those standing outside the bus, then returned to McLean's body and began severing other parts and consuming some of McLean's flesh. Completely random and unprovoked. I remember reading about this when it happened like it was yesterday, 12 years ago. He only did 7 years for it and was released in 2015. Canada, why y'all do crap like that? Just a quick little trigger warning, this one is especially brutal. Story 20. Not a serial killer, but as an avid true crime listener, horror movie watcher, and hobbyist sick F, the murder of a 16-year-old Japanese girl, Junko Furuta, is one that stays with me to this day. I read about it 4 years ago and still think about her minimum once a week. That poor effing girl. I wouldn't recommend looking into her case, but if you think you have a strong enough stomach, she deserves to at least be remembered. 4 teenage boys directly involved in her murder were sentenced to 5 to 9 years and are all out and living their lives now. They have children and have been known to gloat about her murder. Among the horrors of her 44-day torture, this 16-year-old girl was beat with baseball bats and golf clubs. She was essayed by 100 different men, friends of her 4 captors, up to 16 times a day. She was essayed and sodomized by scissors, a broken bottle, skewers, roasting needles, etc. She had live fireworks forced up her anus and set off, causing serious burns. Had pieces of her body ripped off with pliers, had dumbbells dropped on her stomach. She was hung from the ceiling and used as a boxing bag at one point. Had her eyelids and privates burnt off with lighters and cigarettes. Had a hot lit bulb incited into her until it exploded. At one point, when she tried to call the police herself, her feet and legs were drenched in lighter fluid and set on fire, so she was unable to walk. She still had 20 more days of her captivity before she succumbed to death. I genuinely have shed tears for this poor child. Her own parents didn't even fight for her for fear her captor's gang relations would put them at risk. I sincerely do not think there was a bad enough place in hell for every single person involved in her torture. Story 22. Martin Bryant, Australia's worst serial killer. I went to Newtown Primary School in Tasmania. I was about 12 or 13, so somewhere about 13 years ago. Every Friday we were allowed out of school at lunch to go to the local fish and chip shop. And there was always this blonde guy, mid-20s, on the porch that would talk to us all. And after we started going for a few months, he started inviting us all to his house for secret drinks. Thankfully, none of us said yes and very much stayed together. He was a slightly unnerving man. A little while later, my parents had planned to go to Port Arthur, where the murders happened, with us 3 kids and another family. But the other family stayed the night before, and the adults were way too hungover to take us all. The Port Arthur massacre happened that day, and we weren't there because my parents were hungover. Thank F. Story 23. I'm convinced my stepdad was murdered by a serial killer who ran a sober living house he was living at. My stepdad was an addict, an alcoholic who, after years of abusing my family, got kicked out and had nowhere else to go. So he found himself pulled into this sober living house, promising to help get him sober so he can get back with us, his family. For folks who don't know, a sober living house is a place that's meant to be a safe environment for recovering addicts to go and get treatment. Drugs are usually restricted, not always. Different houses have different philosophies, and group therapy is mandatory. They're basically extensions of rehab, but out of a regular house. My family has a lot of addicts who've been in and out of these places, so him getting into one was pretty par for the course. What wasn't par for the course is that the man who ran this house turned out to be somebody my mom grew up with on the other side of the country. He was a friend of my uncle as a teenager, and had apparently always had a crush on my mom. They hadn't seen each other in years, but they became fast friends when they realized who the other was. So much so that my mom actually started working for him, partly because he paid exceedingly well, and partly because she was still in love with my stepdad and wanted to be around him without being with him. And so my little sister, who was still a toddler, could see her dad more often. The guy who ran this house was weird. Honestly, my memories of the guy shape him as a greasy troll of a man with bad breath. But he showered my mom and both my sisters with gifts. I'm a boy and I didn't take his bullcrap, so he was less cool with me. He even bought us a van on the company dollar so my mom could get to work after her car broke down. Like, he showered my family with gifts. It became really clear that he was madly in love with my mom and had a ton of money he could throw at her however he wanted. It didn't take long for my mom to realize where he was getting this money. He was scamming the Medicare system by recruiting homeless people, much like my stepdad was, to stay in his house, bilking them all for their money while doing literally none of the requirements to be a real sober living house, such as preventing addicts from using in the house or any form of group counseling, and using the money to open up new houses, letting each house eventually fall apart as the addicts flunked out or abandoned the program until he could close the house down entirely, but maintain keeping their insurance until the companies found out. My mom wasn't comfortable with this, but the guy who ran the house blackmailed her into staying to work for him. And then people started dying. People had OD'd in this guy's care before, but because they're homeless and usually mentally ill addicts, nobody looked too deep into it. But this guy had family who cared for him, and when he was found dead after just moving in, they sounded an alarm. While this was being investigated, another man, who I remember as the only man in that house who had a car and was always eager to give people rides to any appointments, suddenly disappeared from the house without a trace. But his car was left behind. No body was ever found, but this was when people became extremely suspicious and freaked out. People started abandoning the house, but it was during this time that the guy who ran the whole thing had convinced my stepdad that he was doing so well in his program that he was going to get his own test house to run on his own. But he had to wait until the investigation blew over, and then another guy died from a mysterious brain injury. This guy was only a few years older than me, and I was 16 at the time, and he and I had shared interests. So he was the only one in the house I ever liked to talk to when I visited. So when he died, I don't even know what the right word is. It effed me up. I don't know the details beyond he died in his sleep, but it was due to a brain injury, and somebody suggesting that the owner of the house had punched him that day, but no police report was made. I think it was around this point that my mom finally realized something was really wrong with this place and quit. The owner made good on a few of his threats against my mom, and we were financially effed for a while, but for some reason kept my stepdad in the house. 2 other men died during this time, both listed as overdoses, and as far as I know, no further police action happened because, according to the police, it was an open and shut case. And then my stepdad started getting sick, really fast. He started to bloat and turn yellow. My mom described him as sounding sluggish and looking greasy the few times she was allowed to see him during his last few days. He died a few days later. If I remember right, he died from a morphine overdose, which my mom adamantly denies he did or would ever do. He was an uppers guy, and according to my mom, he had a deep fear of morphine for whatever reason. So my mom was convinced that he was murdered. So were my stepdad's parents, which was when they filed their own police report. I remember getting pulled out of class to talk to the police one day, but it was pretty softball stuff since it came down to, I was never there, I saw nothing, I honestly know nothing, but my mom got pulled into an office at her new day job for a few hours to answer the questions, again at her new office, which she worked at for like 15 more years, but what a start. In the end, his case was ruled an overdose, and no action was taken. You know, because cops love not doing their job properly. My mom received a couple of vaguely threatening voicemails from the owner for a while after this all happened, but eventually he faded out of our lives and faced no further repercussions for all those people dying, who I genuinely believe he had a hand in killing. He was cruel and a full-blown sociopath who scammed insurance companies and preyed on the mentally ill and addicts, ultimately leading to the death of several people and disappearance of at least one. I'll be honest, I don't expect anybody to actually read this long post. I'm writing this for myself because I'm having a crappy time trying to help my older sister who is, herself, currently in a sober living house. And I can't stop thinking about this period of our lives. People like my stepdad and my older sister are the most vulnerable in our society, and our society refuses to care for them during life or even after death. Scary and sad story aside, this is a pretty real thing that happens. A lot of people take advantage of those who are in need and just trying to get back on their feet like that. I've had a couple close friends who were not properly taken care of, so I have no idea what the answer is, but if you have a loved one attending a sober house, I would try and vet it as best as you can. Story 24. This fine and mostly good, sick F kidnapped and drugged girls. They would wake up chained and unclothed with some sick and terrible torture devices all around them. He then played them an audio tape of what to expect and what happens if they don't comply. Unfortunately, there is a copy of the tape floating around online, the dark online. I made the mistake of listening to it, and then there I made the decision that never will I have children. No one should be brought into this world. I won't give you any direction as to where to find it. I will only tell you that I vomited 6 times while listening to it. And when he brought up the trained dogs to finish what he couldn't finish, I wasn't normal for months. Angels and demons are so easy. The true evil of man is completely unthinkable. Story 25. Robert Thompson and John Venables abducted, tortured, and killed a 2-year-old boy when they themselves were aged 10 years old. There was a strong sexual aspect to the torture. They both served sentences as juveniles and were released as adults with new identities, housing and living expenses paid for by the government. The police monitored both of them. Robert Thompson has not reoffended. John Venables has been caught several times with child-adult content. He has been back to jail more than once. However, the British judicial system keeps granting him new identities at great expense to the British taxpayers, and freedom despite his repeated reoffending. If this man gets the chance to abuse another child, he will likely take it. His neighbors are not permitted to know his true identity to keep him safe, according to the judiciary. At one time, Britain was talking about trying to get him relocated to Australia to protect his identity. Coming soon to a suburb near you? Story 26. You don't know their name. I don't know their name. They're out there and they haven't been caught. They don't live too far away. They're intelligent, motivated, and utterly depraved. Their past victims are in a police missing persons drawer somewhere. Their next victim could be anyone. It's not the ones we catch that scare me. Out there are an unknown and unknowable number of serial killers. Some of them haven't even slipped up yet. A few of them won't for a long time, and a very special few are smart enough or lucky enough that their crimes will never be known. There will be no justice, no reckoning. A cough, a splutter, and all the lives they ended are gone with them. Unseen, unheard, unfound, and unknown, the monsters are among us. The knowns don't haunt me as much as the idea that these devils in human skins are still out there. They breathe the same air, they drink the same water, and eat the same food as us, but inside there's nothing we could call human, and we have no way of knowing until it's already too late. Everything is so dark and creepy. It's a weird time for my voice to be shot, so I'm not as animated as I normally am, and it's a weird combo. Story 27. Not really a serial killer, but a reference to a prison riot that occurred in the New Mexico State Penitentiary over the weekend of February 2nd and 3rd, 1980. A group of 14 inmates made their way towards the protective custody unit that housed child predators, snitches, and informants. The unit was known as Cell Block 4. The 14 inmates had planned out to find specific targets that were locked in their cell and murder them in the most inhumane, gruesome, and horrendous ways. One by one, each victim would have to be forced to wait for their would-be killers to burn off the cell bars. The cell bars were being burned from acetylene, torches that were found left behind in a nearby cell block during renovations. The victims were killed by means of slow torture, hanging, being set on fire, castration, decapitation, beating, stabbings, and blunt force trauma. One victim had a melted steel bar rammed all the way through his skull. Another had his head explode from the gas pressure buildup from his face being burned off with an acetylene torch, along with many, many other unspeakable acts of extreme violence. The penitentiary never recovered from the riot and closed for good in 1998. The Old Main is what it is known as now. In total, 33 inmates died, 200 plus other inmates critically injured, and over $20 million in damages, and not a single inmate was found convicted of any killings due to prisoners burning every case file record. The old prison still stands today as a reminder to never forget what happened. Story 28. Ted Kaczynski and Project MKUltra. Mind manipulation ultimately led to the Oklahoma City bombing, still regarded as one of the worst displays of domestic terrorism. Ted Kaczynski, an American domestic terrorist known as the Unabomber, was said to be a subject of a voluntary psychological study alleged by some sources to have been part of MKUltra. As a sophomore at Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as a sophomore at Harvard. Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as a purposely brutalizing psychological experiment led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. In total, Kaczynski spent 200 hours as part of the study. The most tragic part was not only was he an extremely intelligent person, reading his reasons or manifesto he makes many strong valid points. You come to sympathize and understand his frustrations. Obviously I don't support his actions, but it's saddening to see someone spiral and become as he was. Story 29. The Toy Box Killer. The 5th season of Dexter seems to have been at least partially inspired by this. He and his wife, or girlfriend, I can't remember, would drug women and bring them back to his toy box, basically a torture dungeon. When they woke up, he would play them a pre-recorded tape of him describing to them the situation they were in and what they had to look forward to, including continuing essay, light torture, etc. by him, his lady, and friends, sometimes for months. He would hold parties where his victims would be strapped to a harness on their hands and knees and be essayed by his dogs. It was effing horrific. David Parker Ray, total monster. The worst part is he died of a heart attack after being arrested, but before being interrogated. There's no telling how many women he tortured and murdered in around Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and he never faced justice. Story 30. When I was in junior high, there was a serial killer dubbed the Chandler Assayer. My hometown is called Chandler. His main victims were young teenage girls. The whole town was absolutely terrified. We would have to walk all the girls home from school to make sure they got in safe and stick around to make sure he didn't break into an empty house. It was scary and a really surreal experience. In my backyard, there was a small storage shed of full gardening supplies. One day, my mother noticed that all the supplies were taken out and the shed was wide open. However, neither one of us were the ones who emptied it. Further, we noticed large footprints leading away from the shed and towards the backyard wall. The police believe he knew a teenager lived in my home but did not realize I am a dude. And once he figured that out, he moved on elsewhere. That theory was strengthened by the fact that he was caught a couple miles from my home a couple days later. If I was a girl, I might have been essayed during that time. I think about that once in a while, and that absolutely terrifies me to this day. Story 31. Jim Jones. He's not what usually springs to mind when you hear the words serial killer, but he definitely qualifies as a mass murderer. There's something very enchanting about the way he spoke. The audio recordings of the Jonestown Massacre are haunting. The Moors murders, perpetrated by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Brady didn't really care much about Hindley, but Hindley was infatuated and obsessed with Brady from the moment she saw him. The way Brady slowly lured Hindley in by only giving her little bits of recognition over the duration of a year or so, and the way he used Hindley to carry out his plans are both very unsettling. Eddie Gein, who would make furniture and possessions out of human remains. He was pretty weird but also found to be clinically insane. His childhood was awful. The toy box crimes, perpetrated by David Parker Ray, take the cake for me though. Although they never confirmed any murders, he suspected of killing over 60 people. The way he would torture people is really unnerving. Story 32. They aren't classified as official serial killers, but the guys who tortured Junko Furuta are pretty much murderers. The things they did to her creep the heck out of me. According to their trial statements, the 4 of them essayed her over 400 times, beat her, starved her, hung her from the ceiling, and used her as a punching bag, dropped barbells onto her, and forced her to eat live cockroaches and drink her own urine, and then forced her to dance and sing to songs while being beaten. They used foreign objects and inserted them into her, including a lit light bulb and fireworks. They even burned her with cigarettes and lighters and did many other horrible, disgusting things. Story 33. I don't remember the name of the serial killer, but this was in Germany in the 90s. I just remember my parents calling us kids into the living room and telling us the man escaped from prison and was seen a few towns over from our home. We weren't allowed to play outside anymore. My dad would work out of town, so the day after they told us he left for work again. I remember my mom picking us up from school. We listened to the news and there was a bit about him and where he was seen. My mom turned down the radio and called my dad and said someone reported to the police that he was seen by the woods down the road from our house. When we were home, Mom said she forgot something in the car. I was so scared for her, I ran from room to room so I could watch her in every window all the way from the house to the car and back. My room was on street level, and every night I would be scared that he was standing outside looking in. To this day, I can't look out of a dark window without being scared that someone is standing back out there, looking in. I don't know if he was caught. I would imagine so, but this man scared me the most out of every serial killer. I was 5 though, so everything was amplified back then. Story 34. I would have to say without a doubt, Robert Berdella. Just the way he tortured his victims sends chills down my spine and makes me grimace any time I read about his murders. He would torture and sodomize these men for hours upon hours in the worst possible ways. Some of his torture methods include swabbing of drain cleaner in the left eye, the insertion of needles beneath the fingertips, the binding of his wrist with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. Another victim had it even worse though. He was tortured for more than a day straight. His genitals were repeatedly shocked with 7700 volts for up to 5 minutes straight at a time. He was repeatedly sodomized and had needles inserted into his neck and genitals. He eventually died from the torture. These are just a few things Robert Berdella did to his victims. What a sick man he was. Story 35. Not a serial killer technically, but this one still needs to be heard of. John Burge was a cop in Chicago that tortured over 200 innocent men between 1972 and 1991 for confessions. He was a Vietnam War veteran, so you can imagine the torture methods. One case he kept a guy on a radiator and claimed that the marks were made by the victim. He also used the phone box, which was an old Vietnam War era torture device involving phones and electricity, and was all in black in a wooden box. A janitor recalls that when someone was brought into a room called Area 2 and started to hear screams, he would leave as if he heard nothing. Yeah, John Burge is dead now, but he was arrested in 2003 for it. Story 36. Possibly a serial killer, but it's unknown. The Texas Killing Field Murders. Young girls all found dead in one remote part of southeastern Texas near I-45. Could be the work of a serial killer or multiple serial killers with the same idea as to where to hide a body. The location was perfect because this stretch of 45, League City, had a lot of vacant land around it. It's described as a perfect place for killing somebody and getting away with it. Thanks to the work of forensics, they successfully identified every body and found a theme. They were all of similar age, 12 to 25, with similar hairstyles. Police think Mark Stallings may have committed some of them since he confessed to it, but he's not gone to trial over it. Nowadays, the land around where the bodies were discovered has been developed, a paved road installed, a church, there's even a memorial the church set up for the victims. We may never know who killed all of these young women, and it's horrible to think about. Story 37. The Claremont Serial Killer. He took young ladies from a club and pub at an oceanside suburb in Perth, Western Australia in the early to mid-90s. He ended up being caught not too long ago. He was really well known in the community for teaching kids sports and things like that. I was around 15 when the women started going missing. The police thought it might have been a taxi driver. I was dating a guy whose dad and stepdad and his best mate's dads were all taxi drivers. They had to give a saliva test to rule themselves out. It was really freaky. Police were so far out of their element on that one. I remember when police from America and Scotland got flown in just to help investigate. So glad the effer finally got caught. You know, dark story aside, this has got to be a typo, right? She can't actually know this many taxi drivers. Her boyfriend's dad, the stepdad, and all her boyfriend's best friends' dads were all taxi drivers. Granted, I'm not familiar with Western Australia whatsoever, so maybe that's like a main occupation over there and I'm just stupid, but that sounds like a lot of taxi drivers. Story 38. Ronald Gene Simmons. More of a spree killer, but I chose him because he killed his victims in and around my hometown, Russellville, Arkansas, and because the incident that set him off was his daughter, who told him she was going to announce to the entire family that he had essayed her, and the baby she had was his. It was just sick. Turns out he had essayed 2 other daughters as well. The entire family was gathering for Christmas at his house. After killing his wife and his son, he killed each family member as they arrived, hiding their bodies in a cesspit. He told the arriving family members he had presents for them, but they would have to get them one at a time. He'd then take each one out back and forcibly drown them in a rain barrel, or if that seemed difficult due to some of them being men, he'd just shoot them. The youngest victim was a 20-month-old baby. After he killed his entire family, he drove into town and began killing everyone he held a grudge against, mostly former employers. His victims numbered 16 in total, which at the time was the largest spree in U.S. history. Story 39. Ted Bundy, only because of his life outside of him killing, made him seem like an actual good and normal person. Dude was working at a self-unaliving hotline, going to university in politics, apparently cared about the treatment of minorities, catching thieves who stole old women's purses, active member of the Mormon Church, was even said to have talked about hunting the guy responsible for the murders and disappearances, which turned out to be him, Ed Kemper, just listening to the small ways in which he'd manipulate his victims. For example, I read in Mindhunter by John Douglas that when he was trying to coerce a young woman into his car, he would keep checking his watch. This made it look like he had somewhere to be, therefore they wouldn't think he'd take the time to murder them. Just watched Des with David Tennant playing Dennis Nilsen. That was creepy. He's known as the British Jeffrey Dahmer. Story 40. Dr. Lewis Hutchison, the Mad Doctor of Edinburgh Castle. Consider him a mix between H.H. Holmes and Robert Hansen. Originally from Scotland, moved to Jamaica in the 1760s where he had legally bought an estate called Edinburgh Castle. Shortly after the Doctor's arrival, travelers began to disappear in the Doves and locals would get suspicious of Hutchison, who for many miles was the only populated location on the way to St. Anne's Bay, and many would stop at the castle, unaware of the terrible fate the Scotsman had planned for him. What is true about Hutchison is debatable. He would shoot lone travelers, and he, or according to some sources, his slaves would toss the remains in sinkholes for animals to feast on. The sinkhole is now called Hutchison's Hole. In the prime of his depravity, he would invite his victims to dine in his castle before killing them. His victims were all over the map in terms of race, income, age, and sex. His downfall came when a soldier named John Calendar ordered him to surrender. Dr. Hutchison responded by shooting Calendar in the head. He then attempted to flee but was apprehended, stood trial, and hanged in 1773, along with some of his accomplices. It is unknown how many people he killed in total, but upon searching his castle, authorities found approximately 43 watches and large amounts of clothing. His castle is now a ruin, and locals say it is haunted by the Mad Doctor of Edinburgh Castle. Story 41. Jack the Ripper. I'm leaning towards the James Maybrick theory. Ironically, his wife was tried for murdering him. Somewhat unfairly, he was addicted to arsenic. There's a diary found in his old home that's purportedly written by the Ripper. Its authenticity is debated, but it's interesting that none of the dates mentioned in the diary when the Ripper was in London clash with Maybrick's purchase of arsenic. You had to sign a poisons register, which reminds me of the reason for the poison register. Two sisters in Liverpool who were taking out insurance policies on people and then slowly killing them with arsenic, obtained from flypaper. They may have even been part of the wider syndicate. The case also led to a change in life insurance policies, so that it wasn't possible to insure someone without their knowledge or consent. Story 42. The Zodiac. I was a kid living in the Bay Area of California when he was active. His threats published in the newspapers, especially those that mentioned blowing up school buses, really scared me. I don't know how the adults felt at the time, but the Zodiac was the real boogeyman of my childhood. My grandparents had a cabin at South Lake Tahoe, and I was there with my grandma and some cousins. Back then, we would sleep with the windows open, no screens, with a wooden dowel holding the storm shutter over the window up and open. Think of a wooden garage door kind of thing over a window held up by a wooden rod. Back then, the cabin was single story, although a second level was added years later. One night, my grandma woke up to find a man reaching in for her through the open window next to the bed she was sleeping in. Thankfully, she had the presence of mind to yank out the dowel, causing the storm shutter to fall on the man, which drove him away. Later, we found out the Zodiac claimed to have killed Donna Lass, a nurse from the Bay Area, around the same time in Tahoe, the Peek Through the Pines card. There is absolutely no evidence the incident at the cabin involved the Zodiac, and subsequent investigation have cast doubt that he was responsible for Donna Lass's disappearance. But we lived in fear of him during his reign. He seemed everywhere and nowhere. Story 43. There's so many scary ones here, but I'll take a note on a more local one. The Park Maniac in Brazil. He would approach women asking if they were models or if they wanted to be, saying he was a photographer from an agency and calling them to have a photo shoot in the park. There, he would essay and kill them. I watched a documentary that one of the investigators said about how manipulative he was. When being arrested, one of the victims who was able to escape asked to see and talk to him. She wanted to know why. The officer said how he was with his head down, crying and asking for forgiveness or something. After they ended talking, she effing hugged him. As soon as she left, his body language completely changed, like he was proud and tall. What frightens me more is he will be released in less than 10 years. Story 44. I feel as if my life has been weirdly touched in many ways by serial killers. Let me count them for your entertainment. 1. Joanne Dennehy, from the town I live in, committed one of her killings not far from my home. 2. Victorino Chua was active in the hospital where I was born, although many years later, obviously. My dad knows one of his intended victims who survived. 3. Beverly Allett grew up and committed her murders in the area where I live. I know people who grew up with her, one of whom will walk away and leave the room if she is mentioned because her family was involved in some of Allett's out-of-hospital attacks, and the mere mention of her name is upsetting for obvious reasons. 4. Nameless for confidentiality reasons, I nursed a serial killer early in my career. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. He was unremarkable, like any other person except for his crimes. 5. Harold Shipman was for a time my aunt's and my cousin's GP. We still don't know the true tally of his victims because many were cremated. It could be up to 500. My aunt and cousins thought he was wonderful because he was a kind and attentive doctor. I suspect this is why I am fascinated with true crime, particularly serial killers. From the list above, I cannot discern between Allett and Shipman, partly because I'm also a healthcare professional and cannot imagine intentionally harming a patient or the depths of evil that would take, and partly because they preyed upon the helpless and vulnerable, children and older people who had been entrusted to their care and or trusted them with their lives. Allett's victims had no way to tell anyone what was happening, and Shipman's no opportunity. It does disturb me that 3 of the 5 I've listed are healthcare professionals. Chua was a registered nurse. Allegedly, there was some difficulty confirming his qualifications, and was particularly callous in that he didn't know who had received the medication or fluids he had contaminated, nor who would administer them, even if it wasn't your fault. If you were the nurse or doctor who injected a patient with something that killed them, that would be incredibly traumatic regardless of the circumstances. He made others commit his murders. Story 45. The Cleveland Strangler, Anthony Sowell. I've read about a ton of serial killers, and he's one of the ones that sticks out to me. He killed 11 women over a period of 2 years. His victims were all the same: black women who were drug addicts and prostitutes. Some women actually came forward telling the police that they had been essayed and beaten by him, but the cases were never high priority, therefore they were never investigated, even though Sowell had a history of essaying women. The one thing that disturbs me the most is that there were literally bodies everywhere in his house: the crawl space, the backyard, an effing skull in a bucket in the basement. He slept and ate and went about his day while bodies were decomposing around him. There's a really good documentary on him from Vice, and there's also a movie about him called Unseen. Edit. Also adding Ray and Faye Copeland, elderly couple from Missouri that hired homeless men to work on their farm. Ray would get them involved in a scam where they would go to cattle auctions, bid on cattle, and pay with a check. The check would bounce and they would disappear. He would kill them if he thought they were going to tell anyone about the scheme, and he would bury them on his own farm or other farms he worked on. From what I've seen and read, Faye was only convicted because they found a list of men, and ironically, the ones that were missing had an X next to their name. The list was in her handwriting, and Ray couldn't read or write. There are some documentaries about them on YouTube as well. Story 46. Paul Denyer, Frankston serial killer, murdered 3 women here in Vic, Australia in 1993 in less than 2 months. He killed at random, and when police asked him why he killed, Denyer said, "I just hate them," referring to women in general. All the abductions and killings happened around my local street, with one case where he broke into and killed cats in someone's home, and wrote in blood on their walls, happening just a couple of streets from where my mom was living at the time. One of the victims, Natalie, went to one of the local high schools. The police had worked out there was a serial killer on the loose, and the school told students to always walk in pairs and to never cut through the forest area near the school. Unfortunately, Natalie did just this. This is now known as Nat's track. Throughout primary school, everyone thought he'd return all those years later and we'd be his next victim. We really spooked ourselves. Story 47. Shoko Asahara. He was the man behind the Shinrikyo death cult, which carried out sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo subway system. They burned their unruly victims in metal tanks and scraped the remains off the side when they were done, and killed a lot of people just within their own ranks. The scary part was that they had millions of dollars, an underground chemical factory and weapons factory being run by former engineers who joined the cult. He was on his way to getting a nuclear bomb from Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The sarin attacks were supposed to kill hundreds of thousands if they had just been a little bit more organized. They would have. They wanted to start World War III and blame the attacks on the USA. It was freaky. They had enough money that they could have done it. They were so close to actually killing a few million people, and I remember watching the sarin incident on TV. Crowds of people running around frantically in silence because they couldn't breathe as they collapsed on the ground. He also made a couple people eat their own poop, which is just some bunk crap. But he'd also give people enough LSD during initiations that it was common for people to crap and pee themselves, and he was also usually high on acid. Story 48. I don't think she's a serial killer because she only killed one person, but Catherine Knight. She was very abusive to her partner John. She had even stabbed him in the chest. He filed for a restraining order and told his co-workers that if he wasn't in tomorrow, it's because Catherine murdered him. He returned home to find that she had sent the children to a sleepover. The night was fine. They had relations, then went to bed. Well, Catherine stabbed him in the chest in his sleep. This woke him up and he attempted to run to the front door, but he collapsed. He was then stabbed a total of 37 times. The co-workers noticed his absence the next morning and called the police. Police arrived and noticed a bloody curtain hanging in the front doorway, except it wasn't a curtain. It was John's skin. They found his torso in the living room and his head in a stew pot. She had the table set with a meal made with his body. She had planned to serve to her children and even gave some to the dog. She left a note on his body, saying she did this because he essayed their children, but no evidence of him ever essaying the children was ever found. Story 49. Carl Panzram. Hearing him tell the graphic detail of one particular 11-year-old boy he sodomized and killed in his own words, autobiography, gave me a unique emotion. The cold, unapologetic, if not eager, determination to dominate and destroy this innocent child's body and spirit. I guess the feeling for me was a mix of regret, despair, fear, and defeat. It's a special kind of defeat that no one should ever have to feel. When evil is the stronger force and prevails, the magnitude of desolation and despair that fills the void is beyond words. Panzram was large, physically powerful, and intellectually cunning enough for the time period to make life an insufferable punishment for a lot of people. He's the only serial killer I've studied enough to conclude he was true to his own philosophies and convictions. He wanted to dedicate his mind and body entirely to inflicting as much pain and cruelty to humankind as possible. Calling Carl Panzram disturbing or frightening just fails flat of reality. He was without a doubt the boogeyman, the adversary of mankind. Story 50. Ed Gein and Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Ed Gein's story inspired the creation of films like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw, and Silence of the Lambs, if I remember correctly. His mom was a terrible woman who would preach that all women but herself were promiscuous and tools of Satan. A store owner disappeared and witnesses said they saw Ed. When they searched his shed, they found her hanging upside down, as though she were a deer. When they searched the house, they discovered that he used the skin and skulls of the women he killed as furniture. He stole from graves, and after his mother's passing, he started creating a woman's suit so that he could become his mom and finally crawl into her skin. You can find a list of things he made the bodies of. Rodney Alcala was a convicted assayer and serial killer, and his victim count is unknown since they found like 1,000 pictures of women, and it has been speculated that they are victims of his. He is called the dating game killer because during the time he was killing women, he appeared on a game show and won, but the woman who picked him later said that she felt weirded out and didn't go out with him. I watched a documentary on his first known crime, which involved an 8-year-old girl that he lured into his place. Ed comes to mind the most, since the idea that he created furniture using the body parts of women, it didn't matter what it was, and he inspired those infamous movies. Killers kind of shows you how crazy the man was. But with Rodney, it was how creepy he was. He would approach you and say he was a photographer and wanted pictures and to try to get you to come with him for them. He acted as his own attorney for a trial and is still alive, even though he was sentenced to death for a third time. Story 52. I love reading about true crime, so out of curiosity, I sometimes read transcripts of tapes to get a better grasp of the case. The toy box killer David Parker Ray had a tape he played for victims when they were captured. I made it about halfway through before I had to, watch kittens on YouTube and recover. I think the scariest part for me about that case is that most of his surviving victims don't remember the torture because they were heavily drugged. One woman was identified by a tattoo in a torture video and said that until she saw the tape, she wouldn't have guessed something had happened to her. And also because he used women accomplices to lure in victims, sometimes even girls they knew. It gives me trust issues. If you are a woman, that case will F with your head. If you have a moment of, gosh, what if something like that happened to me, but I don't remember it. Also, these women weren't all sex workers. I support sex workers, of course. But what I mean is, it could have been anyone. Any job, any life, anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes I'll see a case and be reassured, I would have been fine because he targeted sex workers and that's not my job, or I have dark hair and he went after blondes, so I'm okay. But in this case, it's what do you have to do to stay safe? Who do you have to not trust? Story 53. Probably Ed Gein. I have a pretty strong stomach and pretty desensitized to a lot of stuff, but when I was 15, when I started taking a huge interest in psychology and serial killers, I learned he was the inspiration for Leatherface, Hannibal Lecter, and Norman Bates. So I decided to research him, thinking he killed a few people and whatnot, but I learned quickly he killed possibly over 40 women, only 4 confirmed, and would cut them to pieces, make things like cereal bowls out of skulls, silverware out of bone, masks, corsets, and whatnot out of skin, even a full bodysuit. A box full of lady parts, lips, lampshades made out of skin, and a couple other things, as well as when the police raided his house, he had a human heart on the stove being cooked. Reading it made me uneasy, and then decided to look at the actual crime scene photos, and it is rough to look at. He's my favorite to study because of how demented he was, and just what goes through his head is so fascinating. Story 55. Scariest ones are the ones that haven't been identified. I lived in Montana growing up and found out that there was very likely an active serial killer who operated along a nearby major highway. He only targeted hitchhikers and runaways. There were a lot of towns where the only way to get anywhere was either unpaved back roads, wilderness, or the highway. People would go missing, then remains or clothes would show up somewhere, and eventually somebody put it together that there was a clear pattern. The police response was basically, dang, that sucks, doesn't it? But we don't really care since everyone targeted is extremely poor and or a minority. I could never find anything on it nationally. It was all local stuff the last time I went back there. The worst thing is about any investigator could make a few calls, put a file together, and call the FBI. But even that's considered a hassle. Part of that is because a lot of the cops have ties to far-right groups, but that's a whole other issue. Story 56. Don't know their name by memory. It was a couple who would kidnap girls around 16 years old. They would go hundreds of miles to find their perfect girl, stalk them for months, then finally grab them. They would bring them back to their house and put them in a dungeon that they spent a bunch of money on. They would play the same tape to each of them, and they would wake up, the guy talking about everything he was going to do to them and what they have done to countless others. At the end, basically exclaiming that they have found a perfect formula to make them forget every single thing that happened in those months. They would then clean the body completely up with no trace of any DNA. Then they would drop them off at some random location. The girls never remembered anything that happened. They only knew what happened through the tapes the guy had. It was really grotesque. If any can remember who they were, just comment down. I feel slightly uneasy that we're learning so much about this that we can probably guess who this was. This is a pretty spooky script they gave me. Story 57. John Wayne Gacy. I almost might not have existed because of him. In the spring of 1972, my grandfather had met Gacy through some associates at one of his fraternal clubs. I can't remember if it was an Elks or Shriners or VFW thing, and they were talking for a bit, and Gacy learned that my grandfather had 2 sons, aged 20 and 17, that were looking for some part-time work that summer. Gacy suggested that they come over to his house to do some landscaping work and other assorted odd jobs. My father and my uncle ended up going over to his house about early June at the end of the week, expecting to be over the weekend working on some things. By the end of the first day working there, they were both so creeped out by Gacy, constantly trying to corner them alone and invite them to hang out afterwards to drink. They decided to blow off the weekend and not even come back for that day's wages. My grandfather was enraged that my dad and his uncle would blow off a job like that and yelled at them all weekend, but they both utterly refused to return. Story 58. Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., known before his capture as the East Area Essayer and Original Night Stalker, or the Erons, and separately as the Visalia Ransacker. Prior to his capture, it wasn't certain if they were the same person. He's responsible for over 13 murders and 50 SA cases. What really got to me was his sheer ballsiness, breaking into homes and leaving equipment to bind up his victims hidden there before later returning, waking up couples in bed with a flashlight in their eyes, stacking dishes on the husband's back, before essaying them both and threatening to kill everyone if he heard the dishes crash. His sheer ballsiness and how he escaped time and time again despite the police going all out and hunting him. One example, a woman driving a car saw him crawling up to a house. One time within seconds he had the run up and was trying to break into her car. She sped away and he picked up a bike and chased her car before she managed to get away. Oh, and he'd phone his SA victims and taunt them to terrorize them. Now that he's been caught, he isn't a faceless boogeyman anymore, though the fact that he was an active duty police officer during the height of his SA spree explains a lot. As a kid, I also used to scare myself watching Jack the Ripper documentaries. Story 59. Jeff Dahmer. He drilled holes into people's heads and poured acid into the holes in the hopes of making a sex zombie. Can you imagine the terror of being held and drugged and being aware that this psychopath that's holding you against your will, that's now probably eaten former victims in front of you, gets a drill and starts boring through your skull into your brain? I'm guessing his victims were conscious for this. Then he proceeds to pour acid into your brain. I imagine you could feel the pain from it until it actually got to your brain. Then possibly instantly losing the ability to smell. All of a sudden you have no memory before being 10. You can't see anymore. Then the sick effer keeps you alive as a human sock as long as he can before he ultimately kills you and eats you. Horrifying. Story 60. No one ever brings this guy up, but I heard about him on the last podcast on the left. Joseph Kallinger is by far the most disturbing serial killer to me. He had severe schizophrenia since childhood and would have the most effed up hallucinations. He said a floating white mannequin head named Charlie would follow him around and tell him to do things. Here's a list of some of the most horrific stuff he did. Mixed his own fluids with his daughter's formula when she was a baby and fed it to her. Took a household of people hostage and tied a man up in the basement. He brought a woman down and told her that if she didn't chew off the dude's chicken, he would shoot her. Her response was, "Shoot me, I don't want to live." Dug a deep hole in his basement and filled it with liquids and feces. Killed one of his sons because he thought he had to save the world. Also, he was obsessed with the idea of castrating everyone in the world to kill them all. He actually thought that if you cut a man's chicken off, the guy would deflate and die. So yeah, pretty gosh dang disturbing. Story 61. DC Sniper, because we lived through it. It was my senior year of high school, and no one knew when or where the next person would be hit. 2 of the shootings happened very close to home. One was a gas station 2 miles away that we frequented. He shot at people shopping and at the school, and it was just random. They canceled everything after school, and you'd get in trouble for taking too long in the parking lot after school. They told those of us who drove to run to our cars. It seemed like forever before they even had any idea of what was going on or where he was even shooting from. Always the wooded areas, and suburban VA has plenty of those. We just stayed inside as much as possible. But back then, 2002, you didn't have Amazon and delivery services, so you still had to grocery shop and run your errands out in the open. Story 62. I don't know if this counts, but whoever killed Stevie Branch, Chris Byers, and James Moore in West Memphis in 1993. 3 teenage boys, the West Memphis Three, were accused and convicted of the crime, which they almost assuredly did not commit. They were just 3 misfits accused by lazy investigators, feeling pressure from his community to do something. Important evidence, such as a bloody transient washing up in the diner bathroom, was ignored. Whoever did it murdered not only 3 young boys, but was also happy seeing 3 innocent teenagers suffer a public, sensationalized trial, including watching one of them face the death sentence. Not only that, evidence is high that one of the boys was essayed at least once before he died. Whoever murdered those boys and then let 3 other kids take the fall for it is a monster who got away with it. Story 63. Gary Ridgway, Green River Killer. I was 11 when the first 3 women were found. They were found very close to a place my friends and I would play in the summer. As I got older, I spent a lot of time in the same areas of highways 18 and 410 where he dumped some victims. My friends and I went out after dark in Seattle, close to where he lived, and killed a woman in his home. My father is buried in a cemetery across the road from a steep drop-off where others were dumped. My father also used to work for Packard, the company that owns Kenworth, Ridgway's employer. Hearing about all the dump sites on the news after the guilty pleas and recognizing so many of them as places I'd been, driven by, and knew very well was disturbing. Places I'd driven past twice a day for years on my way back to work, some only a few miles from my house. Just thinking you have something in common with a monster like that is extremely unpleasant, even if it is just coincidental. Story 65. A list of items found in Ed Gein's house after his arrest. Searching the house, authorities found whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chairs and seats, skulls on his bedposts, female skulls, some with the top sewn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from the shoulders to the waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Warden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Warden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's pot-bellied stove, 9 vulvae in a shoebox, a young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15, a belt made from nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails from female fingers. Story 66. There's one serial killer that I think about a lot. He was believed to be the Golden State Killer for a long time, but I don't think there was any hard evidence that it was him, even after he was caught. A man would break into married couples' homes and force the husband to lay on his stomach and stack dinner plates on his back, and then he would essay them. If the dinner plates fell, he would kill them. There's just something so horrifically evil about making a person lay perfectly still while being essayed. The physiological torment against both victims is worse than the murder for me. Story 67. Richard Chase, aka the Vampire of Sacramento, is the reason I always lock my doors. He was a paranoid schizophrenic hypochondriac who absolutely fried his brain with LSD. He suffered from Cotard delusion or walking corpse syndrome. In short, he thought he didn't have enough blood in his body, more of a spree killer than a true serial killer. He was a disorganized murderer and cannibal who felt that an unlocked door was an invitation to come inside and eat your organs or drink your blood. He said locked doors made him feel unwelcome. I find him scary because he wasn't evil so much as very confused. He may never have killed if it weren't for the fact that nobody really wanted to deal with him. His parents, the police, psychiatric institutions, they all just kind of said, ew, this guy is weird, but I don't really want to effing deal with it. It's probably fine, just shoo him away. Story 68. Daniel J. LaPlante, aka the Andrews Family Haunting. Holy crap, I am an avid listener of the podcast, my favorite murder, and out of all the murders I listened to, this one still haunts me. Essentially, this teenage boy stalked and eventually convinced this teenage girl to go out with him. He was creepy AF, so there was no second date. Undeterred, the boy proceeded to hide in the walls of the girl's house for months and terrorize her and her sister. He crested tunnels, peepholes, etc. to spy on them and harass them. The girls, not knowing better, were convinced the house was haunted, and the worst part was that their father didn't believe them. The girls became hysterical with fear, and that's when their dad finally finally took it seriously. They found a note that read something along the lines of, "Come find me, I am in your room," written in blood in the basement. The father goes to the room, finds the boy dressed in the dead wife's clothes, holding a hatchet and smiling. They struggle, but the boy gets away and proceeds to murder 3 people of a different household the next day. I highly recommend listening to episode 137 of My Favorite Murder for more details, and for you murderinos out there, stay sexy and don't get murdered. Story 69. Rodney Alcala. He went on the dating game despite being a convicted felon. He won, but the lady rejected the date because she found him creepy. Another contestant said he was very strange and had bizarre opinions. He would take pictures of women and had a locker full of them that police believe are of his victims. Some are staged with the lady posing for his camera, and some are clearly taken without their knowledge or consent. He would choke his victims to the point they'd pass out, revive them, and do it again. A real sadistic piece of crap. Edit. I think the scarier one now that I think about it is the Golden State Killer, aka the original Night Stalker, aka East Area Assayer, Joseph James D'Angelo. He was a former cop and sailor who would break into homes, have the female victim tie up her husband, and then place dinner plates on them. If he heard the dinner plates fall, he would murder everyone in the house. He'd then proceed to brutally essay everyone in the home. What scares the crap out of me is how he would linger for a long time in the victims' homes. One story was a mother and daughter tied down, and she thought that he had gone, despite the daughter saying that he was still in the home. He was still in the shadows, and burst forward to scare the living crap out of them some more. He would also apparently call his victims over the years and taunt them. His crimes spanned all over California, and authorities didn't realize that the East Side Assayer and the Golden State Killer were the same guy for a long time. Patton Oswalt's late wife was actually doing research and wrote a book about him before she passed. It's a good testament to her life's work. She probably helped catch that piece of dog crap and bring him to justice. Story 70. I forget the guy's name, but he used to be an enforcer and hitman for a big gang, I presume the mob in the US. Most of his kills were fairly professional, if brutal. He used a lot of guns and knives to kill people efficiently but not mercifully. One day he broke into a religious man's house at night and was surprised to find the man awake. Desperate, the man prayed to God that he be saved. The killer, being distinctly atheist, told the man that he would give him an hour to pray, and if nothing happened to force the killer to leave, he would shoot the man in the head. After an hour, nothing happened, and the killer shot the man. When a writer asked if he regretted anything, the killer said that he hated the way he handled that. He was never a nice guy, but the way he handled that specific case made even a professional murderer regretful and uneasy. The thought of being given a single chance to save my own life from a professional killer makes me anxious. Story 71. I heard Serial Killers podcast on Spotify, on a lot of different ones, but the thing Jeffrey Dahmer did to his victims, both before and after, was pretty messed up. He tried pouring acid and boiling hot water into his victims' skulls while they were alive, so he could have an alive zombie so that he could use for his satisfaction. If I remember correctly, he had some of them on sticks and other body parts laying around his house in the freezer. He killed mostly black males. Can't remember if it was because he was mostly attracted to black guys or he just knew police didn't care too much. I can really recommend the Serial Killers podcast. They go very in depth with what happened in their upbringing and kills, etc. Story 72. David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer, Satan's Den. Kidnapped women of all ages, according to his tapes, and for years tortured them. Him and his girlfriend would go out and snatch women up in New Mexico. His daughter helped abduct her friend. He'd also use his dogs to essay the women. When he's done with them, he'd brainwash them with heavy drugs for days. The scary thing is he said that him and his girl and a circle of friends were into this and made it a regular party. Only David, his girlfriend, and one man were charged. The daughter was let off with a 2-year sentence, and no other people were brought forward to be judged. There might still be a handful of friends continuing this habit. The FBI has a strong sense that there are many victims still alive and need help to link possible trophies with murder victims. Some did come forward, and it's sad to hear that their claims were dismissed as crazy. One woman lost her marriage because the husband thought she was cheating, but she was being tortured for those 2 days. He thought she was out with another man. As for the girlfriend, Hendy was sentenced to 36 years in prison for kidnapping and torture. She served only half of that because legislation at that time allowed for early release. The law was amended just 3 months after Hendy was sentenced and rewritten to require criminals to serve 85% of their sentencing. She was released in July of 2019. Rather than getting out on parole, Hendy served her 2 years in parole in prison. Because Hendy wasn't released on parole, she is under no stipulation to answer to the state and is not required to tell officials where she's living or what she's doing. Scary to see the address of where this happened and see the same home and torture room converted into a regular home with its history, nearly identical from back then. Chills. That tape would be playing in the room as you wake up, the intro to your living hell. I'm sorry, I don't care how good of a deal you get on a house like that, there is no way you can go on living in there. Honestly, even if they tore the house down and built a new one on the property, it just feels evil. Story 73. Dennis Des Nilsen. I remember learning about him, but after watching Des, a lot of key details came back to me. Strangled 12 to 15 men and boys, attempted to kill another 7 in the late 70s and early 80s. These were all vulnerable men, drug users, homeless, some were gay. Befriended them, brought them back to his place and had a good time with them before getting them blackout drunk and killing them. Got away with it for so long due to homophobia and the vulnerable nature of his victims. I think the most frightening part is that he bathed, dressed, watched TV, and listened to music with his victims after he killed them. He then buried them in the floorboards in his first place, then moved them to the garden. Second place he used to dispose of the flesh was down the toilet, which is how he got caught. A clogged drain. That, and he looked so bloody ordinary. Died in 2018. Story 74. Ted Bundy. Because my dad worked in a building Bundy used to crash in when Bundy worked for the Department of Emergency Services in Olympia, Washington. The building was owned by the state of Washington, and after Bundy was executed, they used it for FEMA and emergency management purposes, which was my dad's job at the time. Apparently, Bundy used to sleep on the couch in the basement while he was helping look for his own victims. And every time I went into the building, the hairs on the back of my neck would always stand up. As a kid, and Bundy was executed years before, but I always got creeped out, but had no logical explanation until some years later, when I heard my dad telling friends about the building he used to work in, that Bundy used to sleep there. Story 75. Joachim Corll and Andre Chikatilo. Dan Cummings' Time Suck has done podcasts on both these women, child, and essayers, necrophiliacs, and cannibals. The podcasts are hard to listen to without feeling sick. These two are seriously the most sadistic and bloodthirsty serial killers that I've heard about, and both escapes capture to keep reoffending. One's from West Germany, and the other from Russia. Joachim George Corll was a West German serial killer, child assayer, necrophile, and cannibal. He was known as the Ruhr Cannibal, Ruhr Hunter, and the Duisburg Man-Eater. He was convicted of 8 murders but confessed to a total of 14, which he committed in and around the Ruhr metropolitan description. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer named the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper, who essayed, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990 in the Russian SFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Uzbek SSR. Story 76. I would have to say Charles Manson. Although he was never present at any of the murders, the fact that he had that level of power over individuals to get them to kill for him. The most beautiful actress I've ever seen, the late Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant and married to director Roman Polanski. In court, the Manson family, individuals being charged, said she begged for them not to kill her baby, but they began stabbing her with a fork a total of 41 times. Abigail Folger, heir to Folger's Coffee, all of this, and Los Feliz murderers, ordered by a man who stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall. I would like to think these monsters like this are to suffer the worst kind of punishments when they go before God. When your time is up, you should have the ability to go in peace. I think that is something we can all agree on. Story 77. I don't know if it was just urban legend, but I was told, or if the serial killer really existed. Maybe some older German Redditors can help with this. I live in Germany, close to the French border. When I was around 10 years old, my friends and I went to Catholic camp. It's tradition here to go to camp for a week before getting your first Holy Communion. Google Translate, no idea if this is the right word for it. A friend of mine told me about this murderer that kidnapped boys from camps in the general location of the borders of Germany, Switzerland, and France. He wears a red mask and never spoke or made any sounds. One child noticed him kidnapping his friend out of the campsite and drew him with the mask on. He apparently was never found. Even if it's just an urban legend, till this day I'm a bit startled when going camping because his story was branded into my brain. Other than this personal story, what stuck most to me is Walter Seifert. He wasn't a serial killer in that common sense, but he did rampage with a flamethrower in a primary school in Germany in the 60s. Seeing the documentary about this guy still gives me the chills. Story 79. I can't believe I haven't seen Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. They killed 5 children and essayed at least 4 of them, then buried their bodies on one of the moors, hence the term the Moors Murderers. When they were sentenced, the judge called them 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. Bradley was up before court on dozens of charges before he was 18, largely theft, but he was also threatened, and his school girlfriend with a flock knife because she visited a dance with someone else, was fired from a heap of jobs for everything from theft to drunkenness. Hindley's father was an ex-parachute regiment alcoholic who expected his daughter to be tough. When she was 7 or 8, he literally taught her to fight. A kid scratched her cheek a little later, and he threatened to beat her with a leather strap if she didn't retaliate. She then went and beat the boy to the ground, calling it her first victory. She basically was raised in a violent household that rewarded violence, and empathy was discouraged. She got a job as a typist at 18 in the same company where Brady was now a bookkeeper, and became infatuated despite his criminal record. Possibly worth noting that this began before she even spoke to him. They eventually started dating, a predictable pattern of an X-rated film, what we now call an 18-rated film, followed by German wine at his home. That was definitely a turning point. Brady has an unhealthy interest in Nazi history and supplies Hindley with reading material on it. Most say their first date was the film Judgment at Nuremberg, though she had denied it. They would read aloud from books on Nazi atrocities in public, and she began to emulate an Aryan appearance, bleaching her hair and makeup. It was clearly unhealthy. Even when Brady drugged her, she remained infatuated. Basically, she had a similar relationship to him that members of cults have to their leaders. She genuinely said in a parole application that if he said the world was flat, she would have believed him. The two slowly became more isolated and became obsessed with crime, torture, and philosophy. They also had a quirk of hiring vans, then planning bank robberies in them. She also learned to shoot, joining a local rifle club, though she was deemed too poor a shot and too short-tempered to join the pistol club, though she still managed to convince 2 members to sell her a .45 and a .38, along with her .22 caliber rifle. When bank robbery became boring, they moved to photography, not what I'd call a logical leap, and set up a darkroom to develop explicit pictures of each other. It was about that time that he turned his mind to the perfect murder. The first victim was a 16-year-old girl called Pauline Reed, who was at school with Hindley's sister. They got her to the moor by asking her to help find a lost glove there. There, they essayed and nearly decapitated her. Hindley claimed she was just in the van. Brady claimed she was an active participant. A few months later, they offered a 12-year-old boy, John Kilbride, a lift home, and then used the same glove ruse to get him to agree to go to the moors. Essayed and then slit his throat and strangled him. They then kidnapped Keith Bennett with a request to help load some boxes. Then the glove ruse again, essayed and strangled. The next killing was a 10-year-old girl, and was a significant escalation as this time they took her home. They gagged her, photographed her, and strangled her before driving her body to the moors to bury her. Again, Hindley claimed she wasn't party to the killing. He strangled her while Hindley was running a bath, but he claimed that she did the strangling. Their 5th victim was 17-year-old Edward Evans. The method was different this time, inviting him to their home where they all drank wine. For some reason, Brady got Hindley to bring her brother-in-law, who Brady was friends with, to the house. They then murdered the boy in front of him. They got the brother-in-law to help dispose of the body, but the brother-in-law could not stomach it and called the police the next morning. The police investigated and arrested Brady on suspicion of murder. His response was, "Eddie and I argued and it got out of hand." Hindley told police it was an accident, but was arrested 3 days later as an accessory. The investigation led to a book with John Kilbride's name and a claim ticket for a railway station locker, which held a suitcase containing costumes, notes, and adult film photo negatives of the fourth victim and an audio recording of a young girl screaming, begging for help that lasted roughly a quarter of an hour. The mother confirmed it was also the fourth victim. Both Hindley and Brady were audible on the recording. Both entered pleas of not guilty in court. They gave a combined 14 hours of testimony in court. Brady was described as arrogant and pedantic. When they played the audio in court, Hindley said that she was cruel because she didn't want her screaming, then tried to deflect responsibility for her part in the killing. She was downstairs when the girl was stripped and looking out the window when the photos were taken and running a bath when she was killed. It took less than 2 hours for the jury to find them both guilty, him on 3 counts of murder, her on 2, and 1 of harboring him. The only reason they weren't hanged was that the death penalty was abolished while they were on remand, so they got whole life terms, life without parole to those who know the American system. They were only ever charged with 3 murders because they didn't have evidence for the other 2. Over the years, the victim count for Hindley was estimated as high as 9, but one was actually killed by his father and the other was found alive 40 years later. The last victim is unknown, but Hindley allegedly told another inmate that they murdered another teenage girl. Hindley denied all involvement in the murders until 1987, more than 2 decades after her conviction. Though she still claimed she wasn't present for the deaths, her confession was 17 hours long and described by the investigators as a well-thought-out performance, with nothing more than she wanted them to know. Brady was rather different. He was a clinical psychopath, and when presented with the details of her conviction, he said he would also give one on the condition he was given the means to commit self-unaliving immediately after. Obviously, they couldn't agree to that for legal reasons. Hindley later confirmed the areas for the last 2 bodies but was unable to give exact locations. They found the 4th body in 1987. Brady began cooperating with police and showed them where he said the 5th body was, but it was never found. Brady also told the BBC that he had killed 5 more people, but there were no crimes or missing persons matching his claims. Over the years, the search for the body of Keith Bennett has been unsuccessful. Specialist search and rescue teams and even a U.S. military recon satellite were tried, but all were unsuccessful. In the years after, Brady was relatively quiet. He made no request for release and rarely made headlines. Hindley, on the other hand, made repeated requests claiming reform, all of which were denied. She's often cited as the most evil and hated woman in Britain. Apparently, in prison, Hindley also befriended Rose West, possibly the only other female serial killer in England to achieve the same level of notoriety. Hindley died in prison in 2002 of bronchial pneumonia and was cremated. Even then, 20 undertakers refused to handle the cremation. Brady died in 2017 of pulmonary disease and was cremated without ceremony and his ashes scattered to the sea at night. Story 80. Niels Högel. He is a German nurse who killed over 85 in the span of 5 years from 2000 to 2005. He administered drugs that effed with the patient's heart rhythm because he wanted to seem like a hero when he resuscitated them. Most times it didn't work though. He was officially found guilty on 85 counts of murder. The number of victims might be as high as 200 plus. Either way, it makes him the most prolific serial killer in Germany since the Nazis. What I find so terrifying about that is as a patient in that hospital, you are supposed to be able to trust the people that are supposed to help you get better, and you are powerless against someone like him. Story 81. Not really a serial killer, but an infamous mobster type of criminal, was kind of the stepfather of my friend's boyfriend. Said boyfriend and criminal did not get along. Usually you hear those things from afar, and then all of a sudden you are drinking a beer with a guy who broke the nose of one of the most notorious criminals in your country's recent history. Funny side note, the boyfriend was a huge bouncer, but seriously one of the sweetest guys you'd ever meet, the type of person you could call to pick you up in the middle of the night an hour's drive away, even if you only half knew him. Boyfriend is fine, by the way. Criminal did not retaliate or anything. Criminal was Willem Holleder, most famous of the Heineken abduction. Yeah, stuff gets real close when knowing someone personally is involved. Story 82. Dennis Nilsen has just been portrayed on screen here in the UK by David Tennant. I have to confess I knew nothing about him before this week. Too young. but my mom remembers. He killed between 12 and 15 young men and attempted to kill at least 7 others. He strangled them and then would slit and watch TV with the bodies. He moved houses when he initially ran out of places to hide the bodies, and was only caught when a maintenance worker was called to his flat for blocked drains. It was discovered that the drain was blocked with human remains. He had chopped the bodies up and disposed of them down the toilet. I need to read the biography written at the time, but for me, it was just his complete calmness and apparent manipulation of the police from the very beginning that got me. Story 83. Definitely Peter Kürten, the vampire of Dusseldorf. Aside from having an extremely effed up childhood and presumably having killed his friend when he was 9, he would become an incredibly sadistic child killer, essayer, and would regularly perform bestiality, which was taught to him at a very young age. He ended up surrendering to the police, and when being served 9 death sentences to be executed via guillotine, he asked whether he would be able to hear the blood gushing from his neck after having his head chopped off, as it would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. A true monster. Also want to mention Richard Kaczynski, aka the Iceman. Even though he was tried and convicted for 5 murders as a former mafia hitman, it's believed he killed 100 plus people easily. He was the type of guy who killed a man just to test out his crossbow. Killing was as normal to him throughout his life as his blinking or eating. Story 84. The Camden Ripper. My brother knew the restaurant worker who had discovered the body parts wrapped in black bags while at work that triggered the manhunt for him. Crazy enough at the time, but many years later, I happened across a BBC documentary on YouTube about him and watched it. The story is bad enough on its own, and he was clearly a very disturbed man. But in spite of that, and some pretty graphic photos, the thing that disturbed me the most was actually the paintings he'd done on the walls of his flat. There was something immensely unsettling about them, like a mind laid bare. The other thing that really got me about it was how he had previously been a functioning adult, a parent who had somehow ended up declining. As a parent now myself, that really gets to me. How does that happen? How is it allowed to happen? Story 85. So probably not one most people reach for, but definitely the Yorkshire Ripper, aka Peter Sutcliffe. For me, he had a huge effect on my family and the people in my hometown. My mother knew the innocent girl he killed, Jane McDonald. She wasn't much older than my mother. She only lived a few streets away. In the police's LAX investigation into the murders, my grandfather was interviewed dozens of times for hours on end, since an old car of his had been sold to a man who frequented red light areas in Sheffield. The police also interviewed my great-uncle approximately 6 times since he fit the description of the Ripper so well. With a criminal record under his belt and such prominent features which fit the murderer, it was no wonder why the police tried to get a confession out of him time and time again. While most don't find him the scariest, for me it's definitely left a lasting impression. The fact that everything was so close to my home, that I've walked and played and lived where so many of his victims were taken, where they laid cold until they were found, that my city was the hunting ground for a man like that. Story 86. The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. I was about 10 years old at the time he was active, 1984 to 1985. We had been hearing bits about him on the TV and radio for about 6 months. I'm not sure if the news was saturated with the reports of his killings or if my mother couldn't stop talking about them. Regardless of how I knew about his killings, I knew. Around summer every year we would drive down to LA to visit my mom's aunt and spend a few days at Disneyland, and my parents liked to spend a day shopping in TJ while we hung out and swam in the aunt's pool. This year when we drove down for our visit, we brought my mom's friend who had never gone to Disneyland. I could write a paragraph just about how the discomfort of riding 400 miles in the cargo area of a Ford Fairmount station wagon, but not right now. Them tagging along resulted in my sister and I having to sleep in the family room, which wouldn't have scared the crap out of me, except they slept with the windows open throughout the house, and that was how the Night Stalker was getting into people's houses. I couldn't sleep, and it was a nervous wreck the whole week we were down there. Story 87. Richard Kaczynski, also known as the Iceman. The unique combination of childhood abuse, working for the mob, and an obsession with perfecting his killing methods create a truly terrifying image of a man who turned his desire into his profession. In his developing years, he was a single-handedly responsible man for a believed murder frenzy among homeless people in New York. Body count anywhere from 50 to 300, involvement in a number of mob murders with a pretty solid idea in where you might find Jimmy Hoffa an oil barrel filled with concrete at the bottom of the ocean, was a hulk of a man capable of ripping a car door off its hinges in one of its many cases of homicidal road rage, developed a skin-absorbing cyanide spray with the help of another killer to take out targets with a sneeze, would take extra cash for making his victims suffer. At one point, as he realized he was getting out of shape, he instead decided to take them to an abandoned lockup and beat them to death with his bare hands as a workout. Once, when someone stole a truck full of bootleg adult content, one of his many side hustles, he tied the guy to a pole and used road flares to progressively burn off the man's feet, legs, and genitalia. When he finally gave up the location, Richard was exasperated as to why the guy had not told him first. However, Richard never killed women or children, and in the case of any contract where he was asked to do so, he would kill the contractor instead. I mean, everybody's got a line, I guess. It's not exactly something to applaud. He just said he burnt this guy alive, but I guess it's something. Story 88. Kingsbury Run Torso Killer. 1. He was protected while active for decades by a powerful political family. The family is still around and they know their ancestor did what he did. 2. Elliot Ness served as Cleveland's head of public security and identified the killer. The killer agreed to self-enter an institution for the insane, something he had done before over the years. The killer promptly checked himself out, hopped the rails, and resumed killing. 3. He killed over a large range, most likely Canada and the US, from Pennsylvania to California, and he did it for decades, just after World War I, a war he was possibly driven insane by, to the 1950s perhaps. 4. He might have been the Black Dahlia Killer. His crimes were horrific, with a headless torso, a typical result of his crimes. 5. He was most active at the height of the Great Depression, and most of his victims' remains are still unidentified. Life was incredibly cheap then. 6. He taunted Elliot Ness for years afterwards in letters. 7. He rode the rails all over America. He was a very big man, and yet he was never arrested, apparently by any other law enforcement agency, or accused of any murders anywhere other than Cleveland. He apparently murdered people wherever he went. 8. For years, Elliot Ness continued to claim the Kingsbury Run torso killer had been identified and the case was solved with the killer institutionalized. Yet the murders, possibly a career of more than 100 murders, continued. 9. Around 20 years after the last official murder, a large man fitting the identified killer's description was seen lounging in the sun in a Hawaiian shirt by the Cleveland Railroad tracks. A day or so later, a headless body was discovered nearby. Story 89. I will never get over the Hello Kitty murder. Reading about everything they did to that girl genuinely haunts me. Researching that murder had the biggest effect out of any I've researched before. Essentially, a young prostitute was tortured for a month and eventually killed. The murderers decided to boil her body and stuff into a Hello Kitty bag, which is where the title of the case comes from. This source describes briefly her murder and torture, but for some more details, I'd recommend doing your own research. The further you look into this case, the harder it is to stop. It's extremely unsettling, and that's why I've linked such a brief source. Story 90. Really surprised I haven't seen this one yet. H. Holmes. He was a serial killer who operated in Chicago during the 19th century due to the Chicago World's Fair. After he became a doctor and graduating the top of his class, he made a fortune cleaning off skeletons to sell to universities and the like. He used this money to buy out an entire city block in Chicago near the fair and built a hotel there. There were secret passages, secret rooms, gas lines in every room to make guests unconscious so he could capture them and hide them in his hotel. The basement had large acid vats and ovens to eliminate any evidence, and he had rooms dedicated to different killing methods like strangulation. He also performed experiments and procedures on live victims using his extensive medical knowledge. He confessed to killing 27 people and was proven in court to have killed 9 of them, but it's expected that he killed over 200 throughout his life, primarily through his hotel scheme. Story 91. The Monster of Florence, Tamara Samsonova, aka the Granny Ripper. Willie Picton, Richard Francis Cottingham, aka the Torso Killer, but not to be confused with the other Torso Killer, aka the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, which is also a horrific case. The crew of Roy DeMeo, Gambino mob family, supposedly killed and dismembered 100+ people at the Gemini Lounge, now a church I believe, which is weird. Also that case in Australia with the essaying and torturing abducted teenage boys to death, supposedly more than one perpetrator. I can't remember their names. These are just a few. Special kind of effed up. Also, if you Google some of this crap, do not press images. Story 93. Richard Chase. He was schizophrenic. He believed the soap scum in his shower was turning his powder into blood and that drinking human blood was the only way to cure it. Picked his victims by walking down neighborhood streets and turning doorknobs to see if they were unlocked. When they dusted his apartment for prints, they found footprints on the ceiling above the shelf in his closet from a baby that he took after killing everyone else in the house. There were several prints, meaning that if he kept it up, they're alive until he was ready to kill it. I read about what had happened when I had postpartum depression. Not a good time. Story 94. I used to work for a UK university where I assisted on producing a forensic psychology course. The course included a video of a woman convicted of murder who was talking to someone working the front desk of the police station who was being perfectly pleasant, but just casually dropped into the conversation a drawn-out, graphic description of killing her family. Graphic detail that I don't want to repeat of how her children died and the sounds they made. Probably doesn't qualify as a serial killer because of the time involved, but I have never felt so horrified and disturbed from listening to a person before. She was just completely calm about it, and the front desk person basically froze in the same "what the F am I listening to" horror I experienced, before eventually snapping out of it and calling some other officers over to arrest her. The name of the woman wasn't mentioned in the tape, but when I asked about the video because of how horrifying it was, I was immediately told to take it out of the course because it was just too disturbing and wasn't meant to be shared with the public. Turns out the academic in charge had access to some police recordings that were meant to be purely for his own research, and he accidentally included it in the media I was processing. I could definitely do without that memory. I've never felt so awful listening to a video, but I couldn't turn it off. Real rabbit in the headlights sort of feeling. Story 95. H.H. Holmes built a murder hotel with secret passageways, hidden rooms, and air vents that could pump toxic gas into nearly every room of the hotel. He confessed to 27 murders, but is suspect to over 200. He was most active from the years 1891 to 1894. He almost exclusively killed young women who would come from out of town and stay at what is now called the Murder Castle, built near the site of the 1893 World's Fair. It was the perfect place to find people no one knew. His primary killing method was via the gas lines hooked up to each room on the second and third floors of the hotel. H.H. Holmes was a product killer, meaning he didn't enjoy the process of killing and didn't even like to see it happen. Hence the gas vents. All he wanted was a product, the body. The worst part for me is what he does after the kill. He'd send the victim down a hidden chute in the room leading to the basement. His basement is like a mad scientist's lair, filled with medical instruments and torture devices of every operative imaginable. And once in the basement, he'd remove the skin, tissue, and organs of the victim, then thoroughly clean and prepare their bones for display. He'd assemble their skeleton and hang it like one of those replica displays you'd see in a science class, only in the 1890s, then use real human skeletons. Now fully prepared, he'd sell the skeletons to colleges and universities, using the money as further funding for his murder castle. Story 96. Golden State Killer and the Boston Strangler. Both creeped me out a lot, but the ones that scare me the most are the ones that I feel I could have become a victim of. I'm a 27-year-old gay man, and I've always been attracted to older, slightly chubby men. I thought Dennis Rader was pretty attractive before prison, and listening to interviews of Bob Berdella actually made me laugh because I legitimately thought he was funny and handsome. I also found John Wayne Gacy pretty attractive. If I was around these people when growing up, especially doing the paper route I did as a kid, I could certainly see myself becoming a victim to them very easily, and that is terrifying to me. Story 97. The Briley Brothers of Richmond, Virginia is one of the most gruesome serial spree killer stories I've ever heard. Basically, a band of brothers, heavily influenced by the eldest brother, ran rampant around Richmond in 1979, arbitrarily choosing and robbing, essaying, torturing, killing random innocents over the course of 12 months, including the torture and murder of a pregnant woman. The eldest, Linwood Briley, even pulled off a short-lived jailbreak from death row in 1984 and almost set the guards on fire. Extremely sadistic fellas, Recommended looking up the full extent of the horror they caused in the city over that year. Story 98. I watched the documentary, Don't F with Cats. It's about a Canadian killer I've kind of repressed the name of because it went too deep into seeing his acts to see why someone would do that. It shook me to my core. I felt it would change my life forever. It's all good now. I sometimes recall his name, but still try to repress it and stop myself from remembering it because I know I'll start searching about him again. I'm not mentioning his acts for my sanity, but they were gruesome. What's scary is he didn't have an ounce of guilt, even in front of the victim's parents. There was a method of his madness, but it's still something I can't understand why anyone would do. Story 99. I'm surprised Peter Curtin hasn't shown up. Killed 9 and attempted to kill 31 more, nicknamed the Vampire of Dusseldorf. 2 insane excerpts from his wiki page. On February 8th, Curtin strangled a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Oliger into unconsciousness before stabbing her in the stomach, temple, and the heart. He then made a rudimentary effort to hide the body by dragging it beneath a hedge before returning to the scene with a bottle of kerosene several hours later and setting the child's body alight. Her body was found beneath a hedge the following day. Shortly before his head was placed on the guillotine, Curtin turned to the psychiatrist and asked the question, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." When asked whether he had any last words to say, Curtin simply smiled and replied, "No." Okay guys, that concludes the recap of all the most horrific and horrifying and frightening serial killers that we, I guess, follow quite a bit. If you guys have any others that keep you up at night, or if you want to give me more nightmares, I will be reading the comments, so feel free to drop them. But if not, you know what? Throw some knock-knock jokes or one-liners in there, because I get scared easy, man. Thanks for watching, guys.